Hi, everybody. I'm Kevin Kennedy. I'm with the statistics team at NHSN. Very happy to be presenting the adjusted ranking metric with my good friend Ruth, who I will let her, introduce herself right now.
Yeah, hi, I'm Ruth Kallay. I'm an epidemiologist on the acute care analytics team, and I'm going to take over from Kevin in a little bit.
All right, so we've got a few housekeeping slides before we dive into the ARM metric. So, some things to know before we begin, and this is going to probably come out. This is my of all the educational talks, I get to be a part of. This is my favorite one. This is designed to, deepen your understanding of the arm, help you effectively interpret and apply the concepts in your healthcare facility. But really, this is going to serve as an introduction to the measure. My guess is it's going to be new to a lot of people on the call, so it's going to serve mainly as an introduction. The most helpful prerequisite with a SIR, and that's going to become apparent as we talk about this, because we're going to show the arm and the SIR kind of side by side throughout this presentation. And there is a really nice resource to review in this link. I know you can't click on it right now, but I'm sure it'll be provided in the chats. Some disclaimers. We are not going to show real data. All the data is for illustrative purposes only. They do not represent actual NHSN data. The ARM dashboard, which Ruth is going to show in the second half of this talk, is only going to be available to acute care hospitals at this time and not available for NHSN groups. And that the ARM rankings that we show are going to be, used on the same 2022 baseline as we show in the updated SIR, rebaseline talks that we give. So it's going to be the same rebaseline year that we're basing off of. The objectives for today are going to be twofold. One, we're going to do kind of a what is it presentation for the ARM. We're going to help you define what the ARM is and how it compares to the SIR. Then my friend Ruth is going to take over, and she is going to show you where to go to locate the ARM dashboard, how to interpret the rankings that are shown on it, and an understanding of maybe special cases that you may see in the dashboard. So the plan for today is I'm going to take the what is it part of the talk and kind of do the statistics part of this presentation. Ruth is then going to take over and present the dashboard and talk about how to interpret rankings and special scenarios. So we're going to start like, any good book, you always start at the beginning, right? So we're going to just answer the simple question, what is it? So I said in the disclaimer that the easiest way to describe the ARM, the adjusted ranking metric, is to put it side by side with the SIR. So this is the standardized infection ratio. And if you attended any of the rebaseline talks like the one 2 weeks ago, or there's going to be a couple more in July, you will see this slide. Like we all use, we all use the same slide. So the SIR is a ratio between the observed SSIs at a hospital divided by the predicted SSIs. Now, for all of the rebaseline talks we give, we always focus on the denominator, the bottom part of this ratio, because that's what the rebaseline models inform. And we kind of just gloss over the numerator because the numerator is just something we don't really have any control over. These get reported to us, and we just simply count them in the numerator. And if you can't tell where this is going, the ARM is going to change that up a little bit. So the ARM is going to focus on the top part of this ratio instead of the denominator. So this is the adjusted ranking metric in a nutshell. So it's a ratio similar to the SIR, where this time the numerator is something that we're going to calculate. It's no longer going to be something that gets reported to NHSN. And we have it labeled as a reliability adjusted outcome. Now, the next slide is going to talk about what we mean by reliability adjusted. But before then, the ratio that you get from this, we kind of interpret it the same way as the SIR. So if the arm is less than 1, it means we have fewer outcomes than predicted. And if the arm is greater than 1, it means we have more outcomes than predicted. And the big difference here, I'll just reiterate this again, is that the numerator, the top part of that ratio, is no longer a count. It is going to be a derived value that allows for fractional or decimal values in the numerator. Okay, so what do we mean when we say reliability adjusted? And this isn't going to come as a shock to anybody on the call, but not all hospitals have the same exposure to an HAI, right? Some hospitals are really big, others are small. Some hospitals focus on procedure A, others focus on procedure B, right? It's not a homogeneous group of all hospitals. So below shows an example of 2 hospitals. And I have a note there that the magnitude here is real, but the numbers are fictitious. So there are similar hospitals to these 2 shown, but we muddled with the numbers. So here's an example of 2 hospitals where the second one has 5 times the volume as the first hospital. They both have 0 SSIs, but the exposure they have is far different. The second hospital has 5 times the procedures and 5 times the predicted number of SSIs. The key here is that the arm is going to account for this difference in exposure. And we're going to see that graphically and through examples in the following slides. Now, does anybody else report reliability adjusted measures? And this is a really good slide to pause on for a second, because yes, I want to make this clear that we are not inventing this measure. So my personal history with this measure dates back a decade, around 2015. And what I used as a guidebook was the CMS Hospital Readmission Reduction Program, the HRRP. And that started back in 2012. It had very smart people on it, Harlan Krumholtz and Sharon Lees Norman, very bright people. And I unashamedly just cheated off of them. It has since been recommended by the Committee of Presidents of Statistical Societies. And just out of personal history, there are many large hospital data registries that report these type of measures, specifically in the cardiology space that I know of. So the SIR and the arm, let's look at how they compare. Now, if you were to ask me, Kevin, what is the biggest difference between the SIR and the arm in a nutshell, I would tell you it's 0. And I'm not saying 0 as a creative way to say there's no difference between them. I'm saying literally the number 0 is the biggest difference between the SIR and the arm. So remember that the SIR, the standard infection ratio, the numerator is a count. And that means 0 is a plausible value. And not only is 0 a plausible value, it's often a very frequent value that we run into. And if the observed count is 0, the SIR will be 0 every time. 0 divided by any number will give you 0. The arm, on the other hand, the numerator is now a derived number. 0, and I have this capitalized and underlined for a reason. 0 cannot be a value for a reliability adjusted outcome. Hence, the arm will never be 0. So below, we have 2 distributions of the standard infection ratio on the left and the adjusted ranking metric on the right from the same HAI, same year, same HAI. So the distribution of the SIR on the left starts out with this really big bar on the left, and I have it colored in orange. So these are a collection of hospitals in this distribution that have a 0 for their SIR, meaning they had 0 outcomes reported. And then after that, it takes on a, more of a traditional normal-ish distribution after that. The arm, on the other hand, you can see that there is no gigantic bar of zeros to start off. Like 0 cannot happen there. The arm takes on this much more traditional, normal, bell-shaped looking distribution curve. Now, the obvious follow-up question here is, on the left, we have a whole bunch of zeros. On the right, we don't. What happens to them? So this is a great spot to talk about the relationship between a hospital's exposure and how the arm shrinks their estimates. So many hospitals that have 0 HAIs or a SIR equal to 0 are low exposure hospitals. Not all of them, but many. And so having a low exposure to an event means you're much more likely not to have an event. I'm not saying anything magical there. There is an inverse relationship between the exposure a hospital has and the amount it gets shrunk with the arm. So the more exposure a hospital has, the lower the arm is shrunk. And when I mean shrunk, I mean pulled towards the middle. And if it's a low exposure hospital, there is a high amount of shrinkage, which means the arm gets pulled highly towards the middle. So below in this table, again, real magnitude examples, but fictitious data show 2 different hospitals where the second hospital has 20 times the exposure of the first. They both have an observed count of 0. And like I said, if you have zeros and an observed count, your SIR is going to be 0 every time. And you can see that in the table. However, if we look all the way to the right where the arm is, the arm gives very different estimates. So the arm shrinks drastically, substantially, that first hospital that has low exposure. It takes it all the way to a 0.8, which is going to put it somewhere in the middle of the arm distribution. There's a very different effect on that second hospital that has high exposure. The arm gets still pulled to the middle, but the magnitude it gets pulled is much, much less. And I'm going to steal, so my friend and colleague Jonathan gives this as an example, and I'm going to steal it from him, but I'm giving him credit for it. If there's any baseball fans in the audience, think of a batting average. So if you have 2 baseball players, both batting 300, which is a great batting average, but one batter has 3 hits on 10 at-bats, and the second one has, 100 hits on or 300 hits on 1,000 at-bats, we treat those very differently, right? Like the second batter's trending towards being a Hall of Famer at that kind of a sample size, or if they have 300 hits, on 1,000 at-bats. So we're treating these differently because their exposure is quite different. Now, this is a double-edged sword here. There's 2 sides to this coin. So the other major difference between the SIR and the arm are extreme outliers. So the SIR is very prone to showing very large outliers. But the principle that the low exposure hospitals get shrunk to the middle still applies, and it works in both ways. So here are another two hospitals where the second hospital's 3 to 4 times bigger than the first hospital, and they both have a large SIR value. So they're both 3.6 to 3.9. The amount that the arm is pulling the smaller hospital towards the lower end, the middle of the distribution, is far more than that second hospital. So I like to point this out because there's a common critique with this measurement that if you have, if you have zero outcomes, you should stay, you should be happy, you should be on the lower end, and you should not be getting pulled to the middle. But there's always a reverse of this, to where if it's a bad quarter, a bad year, and you have a large value, that pulling towards the middle has the exact same effect on the other side. So on one side you're happy, one side you're not. So the world kind of balances out a little bit here. So let's put all of this together now. So this is a scatter plot with each hospital represents a dot here. So on the y-axis is the arm value. On the x-axis is the SIR value. And it's going to show both of these phenomena that we just talked about. So the first thing I want to direct your attention to is on the left of the plot. It's it's an up and down vertical oval, and there's a line of dots going up and down. So this is a collection of hospitals that have 0 as their SIR. They have 0 events. And the amount they're getting pulled up to the middle is going to be depending on their exposure. So the more they stay low, the higher the exposure, and the more they get pulled up, the lower exposure. The second spot I want to note is on the very right. So this is hospitals that have a large SIR, so they're greater than 3, but they're getting pulled down. So these are going to be hospitals that have low exposure, where their large SIR values are getting shrunk towards the middle with the arm. So again, this is working on both sides of the plot. And the third plot, and the third point I want to mention, and this is just an interesting tidbit, is it looks like the very middle, where I show it as tightening at the mean, it looks like you took your thumb and your index finger and you literally just pinched the curve. There's an interesting thing happening here, because remember that the arm goal is to kind of shrink everyone's estimate towards the middle. But it does it in various magnitudes. If you're already at the middle, you have nowhere to be shrunk to. So that's why there's a little pinching of the curve. And again, my history with this measure goes back a decade. I've literally made this plot and talked about it probably 100 different times. And every time I make this plot, they all kind of look like this. So I've got this section for pressing questions, or I call them more preemptive questions. So first, do we need both measures? Do we need both the SIR and the arm? And I'm going to say yes. So the SIR and the arm, they are really good friends, right? They play on the same baseball team. They ride bikes after school. They skip rocks at the pond. They should coexist in a complementary way, but we're going to use them for different things. And Ruth is going to talk a little bit more about this. But the SIR is still going to be the preferred metric when we talk about tracking HAIs over time. And the SIR is also used in other metrics like the CAD metric for prevention prioritization. The arm is going to excel when it comes to ranking performance among facilities, because we also get to adjust for, volume, exposure volume, or reliability. So both can coexist. They're going to be used for slightly different aspects. Next, can my facility calculate their own arm? And this is a no. And this is one of the nicest things about the standard infection ratio, is that if you knew the right buttons to push on a handheld calculator, you could calculate your facility's SIR using a handheld calculator. I wouldn't recommend it. It would be tedious, but you could do it. The arm requires knowledge about the entire distribution of hospitals to kind of set how much things get shrunk and not shrunk. So there's no handheld formula we can give you for the arm. So this is solely going to be in dashboards, and we will publish these data. Next, what do we mean by the term ranking? So the ARM stands for the adjusted ranking metric. So what do we mean by ranking? So when you get into the application, and again, Ruth is going to take this part over, what you're going to see is not specifically the ARM value, the ratio. What you're going to see is rankings, and the ranks are going to go from 1 being the best to 100 being the worst. So a simple percentile ranking. So think of as a kid when you took a standardized test and it was 1 to 100. But here it's the reverse, where 1's the best, 100's the worst. Next, why might I be getting an ARM ranking but not a SIR? And this has to do with the amount of exposure we are going to require a hospital to have to even get a measure. So the SIR requires at least one predicted event, and we call it the minimum precision criteria. We relax that quite a bit with the ARM. So the ARM, we require one predicted event every 5 years, or 0.2. And that's because there's less of an impact of the zeros in the numerator with the ARM. So it is going to be very possible that, in your dashboard, your hospital does not have a standard infection ratio, but does have an ARM ranking. These next two bullets are about phrasing, and I'm going to talk about them together. So the ARM nomenclature, we're probably going to be the only ones that use that phrase, and there's no universally agreed upon term, it seems, to represent this metric or this method. So instead of reliability adjustment, you could hear other groups use phrases like shrinkage, stabilized, or smoothed estimation. All of them I've found in the literature. As far as the ARM metric, the ARM naming convention, so the ARM was never the original name. So back 6 years ago, when we initially went down this path, we called it the reliability adjusted SIR. Other groups may call it the predicted to expected ratio, or the P to E ratio. And other groups might not use any of these words. They might talk about the modeling strategy they use, like we use an empirical Bayesian model to get these ratios. So there's different nomenclature to use for this, and different groups might use different words, but they're going to mean the same thing. And then lastly, will NHSN report our ARM rank or value by subunit within the facility? And again, this is one of the nice things about the standard infection ratio, is you could go to subunits within a facility and get a SIR by subunit. The ARM's a different beast. So the ARM is going to be one rank for each HAI for each year for each facility. So no subunits. So to correctly do a subunit ARM, we would need the entire distribution of subunits. And there's like some computational complexity that goes along with it that we don't have with the standard infection ratio. So the ARM is going to be one value per year per HAI per facility. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Ruth to talk about the dashboard.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm Ruth Kallay, and I'm going to be talking about how to use the ARM rankings within the dashboard. So we're going to start with how to get to the dashboard and how to navigate it. So when you are on the NHSN page, if you go to that dashboard link on the left, hover over that, and the drop down opens, you will see the option for the ARM dashboard there. You can click on it there and it should open up the dashboard for you. Alternatively, if you are on the home page, it should be listed there among the other dashboards, and you can just click right there where it says ARM dashboard. So once you click on it, it should look something like this. So on top, what you're going to see is the name of your facility and the year of data. It's going to be a drop down, so you can click on that and select which year of data you want to look at. So when this dashboard launches this week, you're going to see data for 2022 and 2023 if your facilities reported it. And then you can expect the 2024 data to be added a little bit later this year. One thing to note here is that the values that you are going to see in this ARM dashboard are static. So you'll see underneath the year drop down that it has a data as of date. So that's going to be the cutoff date of when we have used the data that was reported in NHSN to calculate the ARM rankings. That is only going to be done once per year and added to the ARM dashboard at one point. So if you go back and retroactively adjust or add data, you're not going to see your ARM rankings change. So underneath the dates, you're going to see the actual ARM rankings in boxes for each HAI type. And below that, you will see a bar graph with a visual representation of those ARM rankings from better to worst. Underneath that, there will be a little bit of information on how to interpret these ARM rankings, but I'm going to go more into that in this presentation. So how do you interpret these ARM rankings? So you go in and your dashboard looks something like this. How do you see where your facility is performing better or worse? So let's start with better. You're going to want to pick out the lowest number. So in this particular case, this facility, their best ranking is for SSI HIST. And you can also look down here at the bottom at that bar graph. And you'll see that those bars that are closer to the side of the graph that say better, those are going to be the best rankings. So again, SSI HIST followed very closely by CLABSI. So for this ranking, the 5 that we see for HIST, what that means is that this facility is in the top 5% of facilities that have received ARM rankings, or they're performing better than 95% of other facilities with ARM rankings for SSI HIST. So then let's look at the other side of things. How do we find where we're not performing as well? So that's going to be the largest number. In this case, the 77 for CAUTI. Again, you can look down at that bar graph and see the bars that are closest to that worst side of the graph. So the way to interpret this is that this facility is performing better than only 23% of other facilities at the national level that have received ARM rankings for CAUTI. So the best ranking is going to be 1. The worst ranking is going to be 100. You can think of this sort of like running a race where you want to come in number 1. The closer you are to 1, the better you're doing. And this is going to be a comparative metric. So you're compared against other facilities nationally who report data for that HAI event and receive an ARM ranking. So there are some special scenarios that you might see when you log into your dashboard. So if you look underneath that bar graph and you see this section that's highlighted in this box here that says numerator only. You'll also notice that when you look at your bar graph or you look at those boxes with your rankings on top, the ranking will be missing and the data will be missing from your bar graph. It'll just say numerator only. So why is that? So a little bit of background, which Kevin talked about. So one of the benefits of using the ARM ranking is that some facilities who don't receive an SIR because their predicted number of events for a particular HAI is very low, those facilities can receive ARM rankings. So whereas for an SIR, the cutoff is 1 predicted event in that period, in that year, for the ARM, there still has to be a threshold, but that threshold is at least 1 predicted event in 5 years. So your facility might not get a SIR, but it will get an ARM. in some cases. However, if your facility it has a predicted number of events that's lower than that cutoff at 1 every 5 years, in that case, you'll see this information where it says numerator only. And that what's highlighted in the box there will give you a little bit of information about it. And you'll see a table. It will give you the total reported number events for that particular HAI, which is the same as the numerator for the SIR. So another case that you might see in your dashboard is you look and it says no data in the bar graph. You'll see again, it's missing that ranking number in the boxes. So this is going to be for facilities who did not report any HAI data for a particular event type in that selected year. And so comparatively to the numerator only data where they reported data, but it didn't meet that threshold of predicted events, this is we don't have the data. And you, again, will not receive an ARM ranking or a numerator number of events for that particular HAI type. So how should you use the ARM rankings for your facility? So for the SIR, this is a scalable summary measure. This is really useful for looking at progress. What it does is it takes a baseline of data and compares the data that you want to look at for a particular year to that baseline. And so you can look at how the performance changes over time, whether it improves, and you can look at different levels from the facility all the way to the nation level and compare year by year. There's also the CAD, or the cumulative attributable difference, which uses the same denominator as the SIR, but is focused on prevention. So it measures the number of excess infections as part of the targeted assessment for prevention strategy. And this is useful for prioritizing where to direct prevention efforts. So then when we talk about the ARM, again, similar to the SIR, it uses the SIR denominator, but it accounts for the differences in exposure or reliability between facilities. It's also nice because it's incorporating that reliability into the calculation. Some facilities that don't receive SIRs can receive ARM rankings. And this particular measure is going to be better for ranking across facilities. How are you doing in comparison to other facilities at the national level? Another thing which I'm going to mention is that this type of measure, the ARM, the percentile ranking that we're using, can be used. It's appropriate for a composite measure, which can combine performance across different HAI types. So I'm going to give you guys a little sneak peek of something else we want to add on coming up in the ARM dashboard, and that's the ARM composite measure. So a reminder, in the release coming out this week, you will see the individual HAI type ARM rankings, but a little bit later this year, look forward to this composite measure. The goal is to create a single measure that can summarize the performance of facilities from across these 6 eligible HAI types that are listed there. So each facility would get 1 composite ranking. This is again going to be like the individual HAI type rankings, where it's a percentile, 1 to 100. With the lowest number being the best. But this is going to show how that facility compares to other facilities across all HAI types. So look forward to that, and I'm sure there will be an announcement when that's put in a future release. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up our presentation. But if you guys have questions later, just like the other sessions, please, you have an opportunity to submit those afterwards to the NHSN help desk.